Previously, we discussed moral criterion for responsibility of decision as response to value. This time, we will take a look at decision as accountable in reference to the natural law or dapat. Responsibility, particularly moral responsibility, includes accountability. And this is because of the possible mismatch between buti at pagpapahalaga. Buti may really not be buti, and what we value may not really be value. We need reality checks. Those reality checks have already been foreseen, and that is what we have in moral norms, which act as advance guarantees against the risks of moral error. The classical tradition on natural law simplified the discussion by organizing the various types of rules and norms and guidelines into what they call the primary precepts, the secondary principles, tertiary norms, rules, and guidelines, and so on. The primary precept is to do good and to avoid evil. The secondary principles could be constituted by the example of the Ten Commandments. The tertiary norms are the applications of respect for life, respect for human sexuality, respect for human communication, and so on, in the different areas or domains of human life. An insight of modern sciences with regard to the natural law theories, which have in the meantime become hopelessly confused, is to see that we are actually dealing with three matrices of natural law. There is the set of laws which belong to natural sciences, such as physics, chemistry, biology, mathematics, and so on. On the other hand, you have the human sciences, particularly the behavioral sciences, collectively known simply as the social sciences, such as anthropology, ethnography, sociology, linguistics, economics, political science, and so on. These are the laws that we have determined from experience as working in favor of the human good. And finally, you have the integrity sciences, which produce the norms of ethics, philosophy for correct thinking, theology for right thinking about God, and so on. The Pinoy emics in this area have to do with the philosophy of accountability or pananagot sa bunga ng galaw. And the philosophy of natural law can be synthesized as responsiveness sa mga dapat bilang kailangan, dapat bilang makatwiran, at dapat bilang utang. Moral freedom is freedom indeed, kalayaang gumalaw, but it is not absolute. Kalayaan ay walang hadlang na pagtugon sa pang-akit o hatak ng buti, sa pangakong bunga ng pipiliing galaw. Those fruits of action can be either objective consequences, insofar as they change the reality outside of the agent, and that is what we call paggawa, or those actions have a subjective impact. What is changed is not something on the outside. What is changed is the state, the condition, the quality of the agent itself. And that we designated as pagkilos. Such fruits of action are presumed to be beneficial. That's why we call them mabuti. Beneficial for tao and its project of pagpapakatao, and they are assessed critically. That's to say, morally judged as truly responsive, karapat-dapat, sa pangangailangan ng tao, sa kanyang mga pagnanasa at sa kanyang mga adhikain. Before human action actually takes place, you have a moral judgment that is in essence hypothetical, hypothetically in accord with man's nature. And this nature has a variety of meanings. It can mean as human nature, generally understood as likas ng tao, and in our context, bilang binubuo ng loob at katawan, if you don't want to use the terms body and soul or spirit, loob at katawan. It refers to the nature as subject in the sense of likas ng loob ng tao. And that is what we discussed in another segment when we looked at the elements and the dynamics of loob. It can refer to the nature of the human person as an agent when it expresses loob via katawan because it has inherent limitations, wika, which is much more expansive, and bagay-bagay, which represent both possibilities and limitations. It can refer to nature as situated. We do not exist in the abstract. We do not float in the air. We are situated in a world of material and physical reality surrounded by nature and the nature of nature. It is only after action that you can validate whether the judgment was true or not, whether it was in fact in accord with tao's nature or not. And basically, there are only three types of validations. Nakabuti ba? Were the consequences positive? Were the rights and interests of the human person safeguarded? Were you happy? It can be alanganin because ambiguous. And the consequences at this particular point cannot be judged one way or the other as good and as bad in a stable and decisive way. But there are certain actions which are clearly bad, clearly not beneficial. There are negative consequences and unsatisfactory results. So the other aspect of moral freedom is not just responsibility in the choice of good or value, it is accountability for the consequences of one's choice. The power to act, kapangyarihan, is not absolute. To be moral, freedom must first be responsible in its choice of booty. Second, it must also be accountable for the consequences of its choices. Stated differently, moral responsibility is indeed about freely chosen actions. It is also about owning the fruits of one's choices. Ang kalayaan ay hindi lang kapangyarihang magpasya, kundi ito ay pananagutan din o pag-ako sa mga bunga ng sariling pagpapasya. And that is the reason why we need guidance, and sometimes not just guidance, but guardrails. Precisely because the fruits of action cannot be predicted comprehensively, or assessed perfectly, or controlled completely. In other words, moral judgment is never perfect or certain. Action needs some reliable guidance and guardrails. Ang kalayaan ay nangangailangan ng gabay upang tunay na umaayon ang galaw sa likas ng tao at higit na makatutulong sa pagkamit ng nilalayong pagpapakatao. Human natural law, then, is the synthetic term adopted by philosophers for those principles which provide some consistent measure of assurance of agency being in accord with tao's nature and safeguarding the success of its pagpapakatao. If we compare this understanding of accountability vis-a-vis natural law with the Western accents on kailangan at makatwiran, then you will find that classical responsibility is binary. It is polar. It runs in different paths because there are two elements here. There are the good ends, or the finis, or the teloi in Greek, with the right means. And that refers to lex naturalis in the technical sense. Modern responsibility approaches are plural and fragmented, unlike pre-modernity. And so you have the axiological method, which focuses on teleology, on axiology or values, on consequentialism, and these are variants of the first. You have the deontological method, and here the terminology is consistent. It talks about natural law, principles, rules, norms, and other variants. The contextualist method emphasizes the situation, and that is where situation ethics was born, because the situation became the primary determinant of the morality of a decision. Developmental ethics has its own situation emphasis, but it is not the same exactly as situation ethics. Still, it belongs to the contextualist method. And finally, you have the idealist method, where the theme is virtue, where the philosophy is personalism, and the product is character. Virtue idealism assumes compliance with the normativity of natural law, while at the same time transcending natural law. In all of this, one finds an undercurrent emphasizing the affectivity and the emotionality which philosophy has never been fully successful in integrating because of its emphasis on the rational. And so here you have a spectrum or a continuum on the emotional dimension with overlaps, intertwines, and interweaves. The contemporary questiones disputate, or the discussions on natural law, revolve around the following questions. What is the naturally good? The good that by nature is good, however you define nature. Second, how does one know that the good is really and truly good? Third, is there a catalog of basic goods? And those issues have continually been disputed without any kind of resolution. And people have just agreed that they will adopt pluralistic approaches. But they do converge on a particular question. How can human action rightfully pursue these basic goods? And that is the contemporary formulation of natural law. Ang pananagutan sa likas na dapat in Filipino philosophy places its accent not on dapat dahil kailangan, dapat dahil makatwiran, kundi dapat dahil utang. So Pinoy pananagutan focuses on the mabuti at marapat in a synergistic and a balanced way. Values, therefore, are not only buti, but buti na pinahahalaghan. Principles are not just likas na dapat ng tao, kundi dapat din ng pagpapakatao. And virtue is utang hindi lang sa sariling bait, kundi utang din sa buti ng kapwa. The law, in quotation marks, of nature, also in quotation marks, indicates that this is not to be taken in its literal sense. It is to be understood as gabay sa tunay na paggalaw. And because it is in quotation marks, masasabi natin na ito ay malabatas. Hindi tunay na batas, pero mukhang batas. It looks like law. It is law-like, but it is not law the way we normally understand it. Itong mga gabay sa tunay na paggalaw ay upang talagang umayon sa likas ng tao, nararapat sa panlabas ng pagkatao, at higit na makatutulong sa pagkamit ng minimiting pagpapakatao o karapat-dapat sa panloob na pagkatao. There's a threefold use of likas na dapat in Filipino culture where utang can trump the others. Dapat as kailangan o batas ng kalikasan, tunay na batas, hindi matitakasan. Ang dapat bilang kailangan, isang batas ng kalikasan. Ito ay tunay na batas at hindi matatakasan. Ang dapat bilang makatwiran ay batas ng tao, likha lamang. Kaya maaring baguhin, maaring iwasan, maaring salungatin gamit ang katwiran. Kaya maaari nating palitan ang mga batas na ating ginagawa. Subalit ang dapat bilang utang ay tunay na likas ng tao, hindi nilikha, kundi nakikilala lamang. Siya ay malabatas dahil hindi galing sa labas, kundi higit pa sa batas tao dahil ang dapat bilang utang kailanman ay hindi matatakasan. This understanding and accent on natural law as focus entirely on utang can actually be confirmed and contrasted with the tradition. Natural law as gabay sa karapat-dapat na galaw in the scholastic disputed questions on lex naturalis indicate that they saw the differences already then when they looked separately at nature and law. Kaya ang batas at ang likas ay nauwi sa batas ng kalikasan, the laws of nature. Ang batas ng lipunan ay nauwi sa mga kaugalian, mga panuntunan, mga patakaran. Ang batas at ang moralidad ay nauwi sa mga atas at udyok ng budhi, ang kabig ng konsyensya, ang mga pitik ng loob. Another issue regarded the force and enforceability of natural law. If it is a law, then it has its own force, and it should be enforceable. When you look at natural law, in terms of kailangan, it has physical force and enforceability, even without an enforcer. It just automatically applies. If you jump out of the window, you will never fall upwards. You can only fall downwards. And depending on the height, then you can suffer certain consequences. And that is a given. Yung dapat bilang makatwiran has social force because it is convened upon, it is agreed upon, contracted. But this is different from paternalist imposition. And that is the reason why those who do not subscribe to the laws of society react, rally against, protest, rebel, revolt, and so on. Utang, however, has a force of its own because it is personal. It does not come from anywhere else. It comes from oneself, and it manifests itself in guilt, in regret, and remorse. And there is no forgiveness, at least in the philosophical sense. In religion, yes, but that is an entirely different dimension. Another question that has to do with natural law is the origin, the knowability, the universality, and the immutability of natural law. And the traditional responses there are that law comes from oneself, that's why it's autonomous. I make my own rules for myself. Heteronomous means that the rules come from somewhere else, from someone else. That's why it's heteronomous. Or the rules come from God or some transcendent authority. In terms of knowability, in the classical tradition, they established that the age of moral reason is somewhere at 7, but different philosophers have established at different ages. The basic idea, however, is that this age of moral reason is the point at which someone, the subject, can make a judgment of one's activities. There are certain things that we say are so evident that all men of goodwill should be able to recognize. Torture, for example, can never be justified. There is no one who belongs to humanity who can not know that this can never be justified. It is transcultural. How about immutability? Does natural law change? Physical laws do not change. Social laws, in principle, are changeable. But the moral law does not change, or does it? Today, we have different understandings of what it means to be human, and therefore, the issue of natural law becomes a question of whether it is really transcendental or whether it is also socially conditioned, something that we learn from society. But this refers, and it's a very important question, with those acts which we have identified as intrinsically evil, bad, no matter how you try and justify it. Lying, abortion, contraception, torture, or in the Catholic Church, the confessional seal. Unchangeable in the sense of this is beyond human power to revoke and repeal. That in terms of the tradition. You have confirmations and contrasts in contemporary discussions. And in summary, I can present this in a diagram where you can revisit natural law in Filipino culture in a matrix where at the upper level you have the column on the person, may loob, neighbor, kapwa, and the world, or the igdig. And you can divide the different categories of natural law into the formal musts and oughts at the intrapersonal level of duties, at the interpersonal with regard to rights and obligations, at the extrapersonal in terms of determinism and possibility. And so you have the primary precepts at the personal level, personal integrity and authenticity. Pagpapakatotoo sa iyong sarili. With regard to kapwa, interpersonal harmony. Yung nga yung pagkakasing loob at pagkakalooban. And at a larger scale in the world, a certain equilibrium and balance wherein the common good can at least have space and possibly flourish. You have secondary principles. For example, how do you behave and what are the obligations and the rights of gendered existence? And that at the personal level. At the interpersonal level, you have the secondary principles of rights and obligations to your kins versus the stranger. And at a larger level, you have social and cultural institutions with their corporate responsibilities. Even more detailed are the tertiary norms. For example, what are the duties and obligations that arise from the role of a parent or the role of a child? At the intrapersonal level, how do you deal with power status as authority or subject? And at the global level, you have social and cultural norms clashing in the international arena. The implications or questions for secular virtue are that there is no corresponding hierarchy. We do not talk about primary precepts or secondary principles or tertiary norms. The only distinctions are cardinal versus common virtues, private versus social virtues for public life, and dimensional, such as intellectual, moral, and practical virtues. So, what shall we say about the virtues in the biographical sense? Are there youthful virtues, like dynamism, imagination, versus elderly virtues, such as stability and wisdom? How about sexual virtues? How do we distinguish between masculine virtues and feminine virtues? Or are there only transsexual universal values? When you look more closely at dapat as bilang kailangan, then you conclude that these are the norms required of human nature as creature equal to or similar to other creatures. You can do a lexical and phenomenological analysis of the terminology related to dapat, but essentially, it boils down to a prediction of the biophysico-chemical versus psychocorporeal limitations of human activity. In other words, there are certain limitations imposed by the laws of the natural sciences that must be respected. And dapat bilang kailangan ay mga karapatan sa pangangailangan. Having recognized that, we have also translated those dapat into karapatan, human rights, the human right to food, the human right to water, the human right to shelter, because without those, you cannot even survive. So the nature and definition of dapat bilang kailangan is common sense submission to the natural science norms governing human existence in the physical world. Why common sense? Because you owe it to yourself. Because not respecting them will damage yourself. What's the origin, the knowability and universality and mutability of dapat bilang kailangan? Well, the origin is it comes from nature itself. How do you know? To the scientific method. Are they universal? Physics in Alaska is the same as physics on the moon. Chemistry, the same. Biology, perhaps different. Mathematics, so forth. How about force and enforceability? You violate these norms at your physical peril. So, if we were to try and detail natural law with regard to its precepts, to its detailed prescriptions, the primary precept, in the metaphorical sense, is to respect them as the basic responsible action. A secondary principle is to observe the parameters and dynamics of acting in the context of multi- and interdisciplinary physical sciences. And the tertiary are the norms, the rules, the guidelines, etc. You defer to the best practices of experience informed by scientific knowledge. Let's take a look at dapat bilang makatwiran. And this refers to the ideal laws that an optimal polity would legislate as if by nature, in quotation marks. Again, we can do a lexical and phenomenological analysis of the ethical dimensions involved in the terminology current in our society and culture, and you will find recurring themes. Tama is not the same as matwid. Katuwiran is not the same as katwiran. Karapatan is not the same as katarungan. And katarungan is not the same as katwiran. So the nature, we asked the question about the nature and definition of dapat bilang makatwiran, It is consensus or substantial agreement on the norms governing human coexistence in actions towards the common good. What's the origin of these laws? How do you know them? Are they universal? Do they change? These norms come from society. They're determined by societal convention or social construct or contract. It's reason governed by, it is changed by reason informed by historical experience, and sometimes even against historical experience, because posed against a vision. And the force and enforceability, you have various types of social sanctioning, from the socio-cultural to the more punitive. So the primary precepts, if you follow that progression, would be something like the national constitution or the charter as the governing law of the land. The secondary principles would be found in the various legal codes, civil code, tax code, criminal code, or even in the UN Declaration on Human Rights. And the tertiary norms are those which apply to the concrete and the specific IRR, implementing rules and regulations, ordinances, and so on. Dapat bilang utang. This refers to the urge and the compulsion to do good and the debt incurred in not acting rightly. Again, when you look at the lexical, phenomenological vocabulary and look for the ethical dimensions, you will find utang referred to buhay, first in being born, or in the context of taking someone else's life. You have utang na loob, which is different from utang sa loob. And you have the kailangan rights, the katuwiran values, and utang virtues. Kailangan rights, katuwiran values, and utang virtues. You have three very different substantives here, but they are all part of natural law, which is why today some despair of ever rationalizing natural law. But dapat dahil utang at its core is nothing less than hamon ng loob tao sa pagpapakatao. The nature and definition of dapat bilang utang is the sensitivity to the urgings of bait, the protests, paniningil ng konsyensya, and the fear o pagbabanta of losing oneself. What's the origin, the knowability, universality, and immutability of dapat bilang utang? We can only pose the following questions. Ano ang buting tinutukoy ng papapakatao? Ikaw lang makasasagot niyan. It's a personal question. There's a difference between hominization versus humanization. Paano makikilala na tunay at mabuti ang buti ng pagiging tao? Masasagot mo lamang yan sa mga pinipili mong pagpapakatauhan. Meron bang talaan ng mga batayang buti para sa pagpapakatao? Mahirap magpakatao. Kaya ito ay hamon na pang-araw-araw. What is its force and enforceability? As indicated earlier, you can either suffer guilt, regret, and shame as bayarin, but, and sometimes this is forgotten, you can also have moral approbation. You can have peace as the price, as kabayaran. The peace of conscience. Utang as natural law impacts on the core of one's pagkatao, your authenticity. It impacts on the integrality of one's self-regard, your sense of integrity and honor. It impacts only one's specific decisions and behavior. and that has to do with self-respect. Those are given already even in the tradition. But there are new implications and applications when we try to determine the moral versus the non-moral context. Pananagutan sa dapat can be seen either in a static physical setting or a functional socio-moral construct. Context, or the cosmos, can now be seen as a moral category on its own. And context has to be particularized to the frames of human praxis. You look now not just at whether a question is moral or not moral, you look at the cogency or the contextual cogency of dapat, the objective necessity of pananagutan. Dahil nga, ang loob lang ang sumusukat ng bigat ng dapat, saan natin ito iuugnay? Paano niya masusukat ang bigat ng dapat? Here we have to refer to the core value of katahimikan. And earlier we identified as ang tanging buti para sa Pilipino ay ang buti ng tao. Ng buti ko at ang buti ng kapwa. Ang lahat ng mga iba ay pumapangalawa lamang. And that is very different from the objective matter as discussed in the classical tradition. Our objective pananagutan sa dapat bilang utang ay ang bigat o gaan ng dapat ng pagpapakatao sa pakikipagkapwa-tao. Gaano kalawak, gaano kahaba ang saklaw? What is the contextual scope or compass o gabay sa pananagutan? O antas o saklaw ng pananagot sa dapat? And here, you can take a look at the primary, secondary, and tertiary division of norms. You have rights and duties in the context of kailangan, which is why for certain ethicists, survival is the primary duty. You have rights and duties in the context of katwiran, and that is precisely the debate on the common good. And then you have the rights and duties in the context of utang, which belongs to the personal, private sphere. Anuman itong mga ating tinutupad, anuman ang kinahanap nating mga gabay, lagi nating tatandaan, walang utang na hindi binabayaran. Maraming salamat ho sa inyong pakikinig.